Carrie by Stephen King. His first published novel. His first movie adaptation. So how did the two compare? Hi everyone, I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem, and I wanted to compare the 1976 adaptation by Brian De Palma with the original source material, the book by Stephen King. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. I'm a composer, now also a booktuber. You can find my music in The Wheel of Time Season 2, His Dark Materials Season 3, and the newly released psychological horror film, Dead Whisper. So I kind of wanted to do a little bit of a different format than a regular review because I think, especially with Stephen King, we all get protective over the way things are adapted, and sometimes they're adapted really well, and sometimes they're not adapted so well. And Stephen King, I think, has plenty that are not adapted so great. So I wanted to talk about a different type of adaptation, and it was actually his first adaptation and first published novel. So if you don't know, in 1974, I believe it was, Stephen King released Carrie, the first novel that he had released, and supposedly his wife Tabitha had found it in the trash. He had thrown it in the trash saying it's no good. She fished it out of the trash and she convinced him to send it to the publisher. Well, long story short, that is how history was made eventually. The book was published in 1974. And Brian De Palma, famous director who also did Scarface a few years later, he adapted the book, and it came out in 1976. It was a breakout role for John Travolta, actually, as well. And Sissy Spacek, who played the role of Carrie's mom as well. I can't quite remember the actress's name, which is shame on me because she was phenomenal in it. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how these two compare, because oftentimes, especially with Stephen King, I think, adaptations that go off the rails are the ones that don't really explore character depth. They just kind of throw all the plot, throw all the plot on the screen and hope for the best. Or, even worse, they'll kind of discard elements of the plot and put their own spin on it, which is always kind of a nightmare scenario for everyone who loves the books, So I kind of wanted to compare it. I kind of wrote a little list here because I wanted to make sure I didn't forget anything. But I'm going to kind of compare the two based on plot, pacing, dialogue, characters, and themes, because I think this is one of the few adaptations that does really good justice to a few of these categories, and ones where that leaves a little bit more to be desired. So I wanted to do that, and then also compare how did the book and the film measure up. Where was the film better than the book, and where was the book better than the film? So without further ado, if you like this kind of video, please like and subscribe. It always helps out the channel. Appreciate you watching, and let's dive right in. So first of all, plot. So the plot in the book, I was very surprised to see that the plot and of the book and the movie actually followed each other very closely. There were a few little kind of story conventions that I'm going to talk about in the pacing category, but in terms of the plot story beats, a lot of it was very similar. Now, where things started to change quite a bit is in the third act of it. And it was interesting too, because I think I'm trying to figure out ways of saying the spoiler-free, because everything I'm saying here is spoiler-free as much as possible, because I want you to be able to experience both the book and the movie. So in the third act, something really big happens. And if you've heard of Carrie, she's a girl with telekinesis who has an overbearing religious zealot of a mother and is constantly bullied in her high school. Kind of a social outcast. And you've probably seen the cover with her walking, with some fire behind her and, covered in blood and stuff. It's just a pretty cryptic image in the first place. But I think where the plot really starts to deviate is in that third act, where everything kind of comes up to a head. And the book kind of keeps it going a little bit, which was interesting, a kind of a device. So you expect it to end in a particular place, which is where the movie ends, actually, in terms of this big event that happens. But in the book, it keeps going, and it kind of becomes more of the slow burn unfolding of dread, unfolding of horror, which is an interesting way to look at it. And then, of course, in the movie, it was much more of a focused, iconic moment, an iconic piece of cinema history. So it was very cool because I felt like the book did justice to the book and the movie did justice to the movie. Sometimes changing things can be really helpful because, the book is not going to translate to the movie in the same one-to-one way, because there are a lot of inner monologue going on in the book that give you more contextual reference on the characters and things like that. So I think from a plot perspective, I think the book served itself in the way it was presented, that third act, and the movie also presented itself really well in that third act. So that was the first kind of a thought. In terms of pacing, this was an interesting one. I think the pacing was so similar, actually, from the book to the movie, that you felt like certain scenes were reenacted to the T. It was like just perfectly one to one. There were certain scenes that were expanded upon in the book, and you kind of get a little bit more of a sense of the motivation of these characters, which still feels like it's still moving towards kind of a definitive conclusion in the book, but it also does in the movie. You just don't get that extra like contextual reference, I guess you could say. Now the third act, kind of going back to that, and in terms of pacing, I think, how I mentioned just a little bit earlier, where the book really served itself, its medium, and the movie served its medium. I gotta say, this is the one place, and I can't believe I'm saying this because I love Stephen King. I have a whole shelf dedicated to the man back there, so he's my favorite author. I think I like the movie better than the book for the third act. And I think it was the way it was paced. A specific thing that happens kind of affects many different characters in the book, whereas in the film, it only affects a specific group of characters. See how vague I'm being, by the way? But it's all for good reason. And if you know, you know. Anyways, but there's more of a focused kind of a directive in the movie, and it really serves itself because it's kind of faster moving at that point. And so it's not an unfolding of dread, but I don't know, there's something about that pacing that really feels like you feel the horror more, actually, because you feel like it's just kind of a lashing out moment rather than this kind of a slower sense of dread. Now, the book does that really well, but I also feel once that kind of pivotal moment happens, it keeps kind of dragging itself along a little bit. And although more happens in the book, it kind of feels like, I think if you just kept it focused, I think it actually would have been even more impactful. Now, I could be biased because I saw the film before the book, and I know there's always a little bit of a pitfall that comes with that, but that's just my personal opinion. And if you disagree, please let me know in the comments, because like I always say, this stuff is always, it's all subjective, right? But, I always want to know what your opinions are because they're all valid. So let me know, and I would love to know, if I'm thinking about it maybe in a way that I could be thinking about it a little bit different. So that's kind of what I thought about the pacing. Now, the dialogue, I was very impressed because usually you don't see it presented in a film this way. But I felt like the dialogue in the book really gives you a sense of Stephen King's brilliance automatically. Like, I didn't feel like his dialogue was less polished than some of his later works. I do feel like, of course, there's more character exploration and things like that. He kind of perfected the ideas he started, but this was his first published novel. You wouldn't expect it to be so kind of a fully realized piece of work that really represents the author. So from the dialogue perspective, I thought the dialogue in this book was phenomenal. And Stephen King just knows how to write high school characters, He knows how to write that kind of coming of age, on the cusp of adulthood characters. And I don't know how he does it. I mean, of course, at that time, he wasn't too far away from that age. But interesting thing is, the older he's gotten, I think he's even gotten better at it, which is kind of insane. So anyways, that's just a little aside here. But in the movie, I thought the way they handled the dialogue was phenomenal. It was always in service of the pacing, and there were certain scenes where the dialogue was lifted directly from the book. So you really felt like, okay, Brian De Palma is trying to really do justice to the source material. He's not just kind of going willy-nilly and getting other writers in there and going like, hey, we could make this better, And so the author's intention was really, reflected in the movie. But then, of course, there was like a lot of other dialogue that was going on that was not necessarily related to the beats in the book. But I thought that the style of that dialogue was still in the style of the way it was written in the book, which is very rare to see in an adaptation. Then, of course, there's way more dialogue in the book that expands upon specific character developments, but more on that later. But I just thought that was a really cool way that the book and the movie really kind of compare to each other. So let's go to characters, actually, because characters was kind of an interesting exploration in the book versus the movie. Now, in a movie of 2 hours, couple hundred pages for the book. And so, of course, you're going to have more inner monologue. You're going to have, more character exploration, and you can go into the characters' pasts a bit more. if you're having too many flashbacks in a movie, it's going to feel a little weird and kind of take you out of the story. Whereas the movie was interesting because it's all geared towards this one pivotal moment. It's really kind of a 1A and a 1B pivotal moment. One with Carrie and her classmates, and one with Carrie and her mother. So in the movie, you see that from the very beginning, kind of the seeds are planted that everything is going towards this conclusion. Now, in the book, it kind of tells you what's going to happen at the end, or it alludes to it at the very beginning. So you also know kind of where things are going to go towards, right? But the interesting thing was the character exploration. In the book, you get way more understanding of Carrie's mother and kind of the like where she came from, what influenced her worldview. You get to see Carrie before her mother got her hooks in her, and you get to see Carrie as a young kid, and you just kind of get to see this slow descent into her mother's paranoia and, kind of religious fervor, and kind of mental illness, actually, as well. It explores Carrie's mother's mental illness in a way that you don't quite see in the movie because there's just not enough time to explore that. So you really feel for all the characters in the book, whereas in the film, I think, with especially the mother and the daughter's relationship is more antagonistic, whereas in the book there's a little bit more empathy there, I think, as well. And you feel kind of sad for her mother's mental illness. Now, I think the way the bullies are portrayed was very interesting. The bullies were portrayed really well between the book and the film, and there's a particular person who's kind of bullying Carrie and becomes her friend a little bit later in the novel. And you get to see a little bit more of a progression of thought that leads her from being bully to ally. In the movie, you don't see that quite as much. It's kind of a little bit more quick. Not that actually really takes away from the film, because again, it kind of works. But that was interesting. And then the bullies that are really mean till the very end, you see it from kind of a more sinister way in the book, and even like one of the bullies and her boyfriend, like their relationship, their kind of toxic relationship with each other, you get to see that very fully explored in the book as well. You only see little glimpses of it in the movie. And so these are things that I thought the book, of course, would have done better than the movie, but I think in the context of the mediums that they were in, they both handled it really, really well. So let's explore the last category, which is themes. There's a lot of religious overtones in the book and in the film, and it's kind of a little bit of a commentary maybe on religious extremism, I guess you could say, and its consequences as well. But the interesting thing is how they get to that conclusion is a little different in the book and in the film because of that character exploration. I think it also talks about bullying and kind of how, bullying has probably morphed and become very different now that so much of things are online. The nature of bullying, but the bullying in the 70s and I grew up in the 80s and 90s and really more the 90s. And I think that kind of style of bullying I felt like very connected to because I've experienced that, growing up as well. So it was interesting to see that kind of character exploration as well. But I think, so you see the themes are touched upon in the book and in the film. Very similar themes are touched upon, and they're touched upon in similar ways, but the way they reach those commentaries are slightly different. So I guess the last question becomes, is it worth reading the book and seeing the movie? Or is the movie trash and always stay with the books? Or vice versa? I am here to tell you that each one actually stands on its own. And in my opinion, this may be the best, if not one of the best Stephen King adaptations that has ever been. Of course, people always say The Shining. Now, from an adaptation standpoint, it is not the best adaptation because it doesn't really adapt the crux of the characters. It takes the plot points and kind of goes in its own direction. But in that case, of course, the movie's a masterpiece. So that's a different story altogether, and it's maybe apples to oranges. But in this case, I felt like the movie handled the elements of the book really, really well. And yet it still added something different. It's added an iconic moment that you didn't get the same sense from the book. Now, an interesting thing also was, the book kind of starts with a lot of like newspaper articles and studies about telekinesis and all this kind of stuff, but it doesn't really take away from the plot or the character developments or any of that kind of element. That part of it was kind of missing from the film. But again, you don't want to have a lot of that stuff going on in the nature of the medium. So the film did its job, the book did its job, and I highly recommend you check out both. So I would love to know from you all, if you've watched the movie, if you've read the book, what were your thoughts? How did they compare? Do you disagree with what I said? If you've just read the book, definitely check out the movie. If you've checked out the movie, definitely check out the book. it always, it's very rare to find something like this, and especially a Stephen King adaptation that, does justice to both, kind of the source material and then also still providing something different. So that's it from me. I would love to know your thoughts. Leave it in the comments. I'm Nick here with Shelf-Esteem. Please like and subscribe. Always helps out the channel. Really appreciate you guys, and really looking forward to chatting with you all more soon, alright? So in the meantime, be good to yourselves, be good to each other. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you in a couple of days with another video. Take care.